Welcome back to my channel. Today's episode is about clarinet ligatures and how they hold the reed onto a mouthpiece. What I'll try to do today is help you see what critical things to look at and learn more about clarinet and saxophone ligatures. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share afterwards. So let's start right into it. Today is a review of a basic technical study of how ligatures held or even pinched reeds. I originally did this about 15 or maybe 20 years ago, and I plan on doing it again as it was a fairly straightforward test and should be easily repeatable by really anyone. This information, which we'll review, is available on my webpage, which we'll go to shortly. So, years ago, I was curious why different ligatures molded and sounded a bit different from each other. And in some instances, I thought they actually created squeaks. So, why is this? Well, there's multiple things going on here, such as is the table flat and what is the shape of the table? What I'm talking about on the table is actually the mouthpiece itself. This is a saxophone mouthpiece. But this table part right here could simply not be flat. It could be curved, basically concave from front to rear. It could be concave from side to side, or it could be a different shape altogether. Basically, how the ligature itself cradles the reed and not pinch or bend it. Now, in a later episode, we actually look at reeds, the different shapes of reeds, how tall they are, off canter they could be, what the veins look like. But for now, we're just looking at the ligature and how it cradles the reed onto the table of the mouthpiece. Of course, and how the table transitions to the window curve or the facing curve. That'll be done later on. And of course, the reed also interfaces with the tip, side rails, beak shape, baffle, and we'll be looking at throat and bore later on. And of course, the reed cut and shape, which is another episode altogether. So they're all involved in a way a mouthpiece sounds and speaks or plays. But let's go back to the ligature. I remember when I started this, I obtained some really dense foam packaging. And at that time, I was trying to figure out how to identify how a reed gets squeezed, which to me seemed visually evident on some bad sounding ligatures that I had. I was able to shape that dense foam like a reed, at least the heel stock part of the reed, which is the part that the ligature holds on to. I also used a scripto and drew horizontal and vertical lines on it so we can see any type of deformation. Of course, as I mentioned, the first thing one needs to have is a flat table. I'll have more episodes later on of how to reface a mouthpiece and how each area of the mouthpiece can affect the response or tonal quality. But first, just a real quick check. To check if your mouthpiece is a flat table, you can take a razor blade, such as you have here, and hold it vertically and horizontally and at angles to see if there's any space between it and the table. So basically like this, and you have a light source behind it. And you can see if there's any light underneath the razor blade. And you can also hold it the opposite way. If there's any light underneath the razor blade, you can go up the table, different locations. You can do this for clarinet or saxophone mouthpieces, of course, because an uneven, unflat table can affect the reed. There are mouthpieces where there was concave curvature of the table at one point. I think these were on Wells mouthpieces, if I recall. If the ligature put pressure in that concave part, it would push and actually bend the reed away from the mouthpiece facing curve, which essentially makes it more open with other characteristics, and then depends upon the embouchure to close it back down. But of course, that's for another episode, talking about the side rails and facing curve. Anyways, with that shaped dense foam, I drew horizontal and vertical lines on it, and that allowed me to see pinch points of the ligature. With this technical test, I used a variety of different types of ligatures. But let's look at some examples, as I mentioned with the mouthpiece table. Okay, what we're showing here is looking down a mouthpiece. The left-hand black rectangle is the razor blade. And just over here, we can see if that thing gets out of the way. Why is that popping up all the time? Just on the left-hand side, we can see a space between the razor blade and the mouthpiece. Let's go to the next picture real quickly. Here, I circled it in yellow. You can see a little space there. So down the middle of this mouthpiece is a concave part between the two edges of the table. Now think about that. If there's kind of like a trough down the middle of the table, the reed's not going to be flat. It's not going to be flat against that table. And it's going to let air and condensation in right down the middle part of the table. So there's no complete air seal here. That's going to affect your tonal quality a little bit. Of course, the more tighter the ligature you screw on there, the more it's going to fill in the gap, the more it's going to warp your reed in a way too. So it's going to affect the reed. Next example I have here is looking at the table from the side, like this. And we can see some light on the right-hand side of the table there. In this case, what happens is the back part of the table kind of warps up. So that's going to make the reed kind of tilt down flat until you squeeze it down. When you reface a mouthpiece, you want to make sure this table is perfectly flat and you get rid of high spots like that so it's easier for the reed to interface onto the mouthpiece. Let's take a look at a few ligatures now. Up on the screen are two ligatures. They look very, very similar, but they're actually quite different. On the left-hand side, there's this little cradle. There's a cradle for the reed at the screw area. Just a little bit, just enough to make a difference, if you ask me. On the right-hand side is a simple circular ligature. There is no cradle for the reed, and basically the ligature deforms to the shape of the reed on the mouthpiece. Next, we have two other ligatures. Here we have two more ligatures. On the left, the metal one, is a Bonade inverted ligature. This is where it's held upside down on the mouthpiece. The screws are on the top of the mouthpiece. And on the bottom, as you can see, there's two metal rails that help support the reed to the table of the mouthpiece. On the right-hand side is a 1980s Luyben ligature, which has these plastic dots on it. There's about 8 in total, 4 in the front, 4 in the back. That also help push down the reed to the mouthpiece table. This next one is my BG Revelation. I really prefer this one. It's a leather ligature. So it doesn't really scratch the mouthpiece itself going around his body. And the reed is supported by basically brass insert up there that you see on the top. Basically 2 round rails that support the reed onto the table. And the single screw basically allows the ligature to more finely adjust or move with the reed as it's being tightening down. Next one is a regular Rovner leather ligature or fabric ligature. And it has nothing to support the reed other than the fabric itself. So it conforms to the reed shape itself as you tighten it down. Next is a Vandoren Classique ligature. It's a string ligature. I kept it on a little wood dowel that it came on so you can actually see it. You tighten it with the strings on the top, and it's a fabric ligature, and you just kind of tighten it and keeps the reed there just like you would a string ligature. I really think, though, a string ligature is better than this fabric woven ligature, but this is one from Vandoren to kind of simulate a string ligature. Here's another made famous in the 80s. This is a Harrison ligature. has kind of like an X pattern at the top and 4 large platforms, one in each corner, that help support the ligature. If you notice on the arms going up to the platform area, it bends down and makes a drop position for the reed to go into. Now, this is where ligatures can get blown out, where ligatures are over tightened over time, and this drop cradle gets bent, and that's when people say these ligatures get blown out. So always be careful if you buy a used one. Take a look, make sure that there's a curve to the metal going to that drop area for the reed support. Otherwise, it may be blown out, and metal doesn't really re-bend very well without breaking. This is a Selmer ligature, I believe it's a Benny Goodman model with a single screw, and you have this platform that screws up and pushes the reed up against the table. This is a Vandoren Optimum ligature. It actually has 3 plates on it. This one are the horizontal plates. I really like this for clarinet. I like this particular plate with the Vandoren Optimum ligature. As I mentioned, comes with 3 plates. You see the one on the far left side, the 2 horizontal platforms that support the reed. The one in the middle has 2 vertical platforms that support the reed. And the one on the right has basically 4 pins. The problem I found out with this one is that if you over tighten the ligature, these pins dig in to the reed, and you end up with basically one solid platform supporting the reed. So it's very easy to over tighten. It just kind of forces itself into the reed itself. So I found that one a little bit picky. You have to use light pressure on it. Otherwise, it'll go into the reed itself. Here's another picture of those 3 plates in a vertical position. Left-hand side has the 2 horizontal platforms. One in the middle has those wavy 2 horizontal vertical platforms, and the one on the right has those 4 little pins, as I mentioned. This is from a gold-plated one. So that gives us a good rundown of the majority of the type of ligatures that are out there. But now let's see how they actually push the reed down to the table of the mouthpiece itself. On these, I'm going to run to my website I have, which is clarinetperfection.com. And in the technical area, on my website, clarinetperfection.com, under mouthpieces, mouthpiece information, reeds and ligatures, we go to this one web page here. This web page is about 20, 30 years old, so I haven't really updated it. But anyways, let's take a look at the pictures we have here. And then here I basically gave the example ligatures I used. One was a Noble ligature, a simple metal one with a little drop down for the reed area. Next was a Bonade inverted one, as I mentioned, showed you earlier. I also use a BG Revelation, Vandoren Optimum, Luyben inverted, Rovner style, a Penzer Mueller, which had a floating reed platform, and a Harrison. And in here, this next section actually shows pictures of this now. And if you notice here, unfortunately, when I did this is why I want to redo this, is I didn't show the foam I had when I was crimping down the screws of how it was deforming. And basically took some pictures with a reed on it and redrew how it was pushing the reed down. Basically what it's doing is giving pressure from the sides and from the top, pushing the reed down to the platform. Fairly straightforward, fairly simple. The Rovner style was more even pressure, basically just pushing the whole reed down to the table. The Vandoren Optimum was very similar to the standard Rovner style. It pushed the reed down fairly consistently down, depending upon which plates you used. This one, I think, was the horizontal plates going across. The horizontal plates itself fit the shape of the reed, so it was a good interface, and it pushed the reed down in 2 positions, in the back and the front. The BG Revelation has those vertical supports going up the reed instead of from the sides. And it was pushing the reed down a little bit easier from front to back and more straight down pressure. The Bonade, once again, just like the BG Revelation, has these two platforms going down the ligature, and as long as the reed is also flat, it gives a consistent pressure down to the table. The Luyben, once again, had those little round discs on them, plastic, and those are the pressure points pushing down the reed down to the table without a problem, both in the front and the back of the ligature. The Vandoren Classique, of course, was a fabric reed, and it gave consistent pressure because it deformed to the reed all the way from the front to the back and gave consistent pressure of the reed to the table. So what does this all mean? Well, there's some reeds. Let's go back to this generic one. This is a ligature with a little interface here for the reed. Now, if this was a round ligature, and I thought I had it, but I guess I don't, is I found out it actually pinched the reed. So if we look at this, we have an inconsistent pressure point. We had the pressure point coming in from the sides much more than the top. So it's pinching the reed to the table. Now that was deforming the reed. Keep in mind it was a foam reed, dense foam reed. It was deforming it from the edges to the middle. So of course the reed's longer than it, and you're not playing that part there, but it seemed to create a less sure interface between the reed and the table. Of course, most people say, oh, the ligature doesn't matter. Then you get across people that say the ligature does matter. For me, the ligature does matter, and I stay away from the extremes like a perfectly round ligature. Those ones I just don't like. Now, they vary a lot by the material, and they vary a lot by the size being ever so slightly different in size. But I just stay away from them altogether. The generic no blade one I have here, I don't use it either. I usually stick to my Vandoren Optimum or my BG Revelation. Sometimes I use the Bonade inverted one. I use the Luyben one on crystal mouthpieces. And those are my favorite, actually. So that's really what I have for today before we get to anything else about mouthpieces and stuff. So that will leave us thinking about ligatures a bit more and how they actually interface with the mouthpiece. Of course, as I mentioned before, the table of the mouthpiece has a lot to do with how the reed interacts with the player and the rest of the mouthpiece. The ligature there is to hold the reed on. You're looking for a good ligature that you like. For some people with mature ear, can hear various differences or the way it responds to the player. Very, very minute, though. Some people say it doesn't matter at all. Other people say it does. Anyways, that's for later on as we talk more about things. Anyways, I want to thank you for listening to my ramblings. Any questions or comments, put them down below. And don't forget to give a like, thumbs up, share, and subscribe. You got to love the knowledge, you got to love life, and you got to love clarinets. See you next time.